The sound of the phone ringing pulled me from the edges of sleep. I blinked, disoriented, as I checked the time. 1:17 a.m. Who could be calling at this hour? For a split second, 1,000 worries rushed through my mind. I reached over, my heart beating faster, and saw a number I hadn't thought about in years. Dimitri. I froze, holding the phone as it continued to ring. It had been how long? At least 10 years since we'd last spoken. A whole decade since we'd cut off our lives from each other, he going his way and I going mine. I was married now. My life was steady, predictable. I had left all of that. The unpredictability, the rush, the drama, far behind me. And yet, here he was, his name glowing on the screen, summoning memories I'd thought buried. In a daze I answered, barely able to get out a hesitant. Hello. Olga. His voice was familiar and deep, a bit older, a bit rougher. I hope I didn't wake you. There was something achingly nostalgic in his voice. That quiet, warm tone that had once made me feel like the most important person in the world. For a moment I could only breathe, taking in that sound, and every syllable pulled me into memories, into a past I thought was gone forever. No, it's fine, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. It's been a while, hasn't it? He laughed softly. It really has. But for some reason tonight, I just couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about you. His words hung in the air, and I felt myself shiver despite the warmth of the room. Thinking about me? I could barely wrap my head around the idea. My husband, Eric, slept peacefully beside me, unaware of the weight of those words filling the air. I felt a pang of guilt immediately but didn't know how to break the silence between us. It was too easy to fall into our old rhythm, to let the familiarity comfort me. How have you been? I asked softly, cautious, as if a louder voice might shatter the fragility of this moment. Good. Really good, mostly. But life took me to strange places. I lost touch with everyone. Even you. I'm sorry for that. And then he started talking, telling me bits and pieces of his life over the past decade. About his travels, his work, the challenges he'd faced, and the things he'd achieved. I listened, captivated, almost forgetting the time, forgetting the boundaries between us. With every word, it felt like he was drawing me closer to a version of myself I'd left behind. A version that was more passionate, more carefree. I barely noticed when he started asking questions about me, pulling threads of my own life from me like he was unearthing secrets I hadn't shared in years. I have to say, I always wondered what would have happened if things hadn't ended the way they did. He said quietly, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. I held my breath. What if? That was a question I hadn't let myself consider in years. I knew I shouldn't answer, shouldn't let myself open that door. But a part of me, the part that still yearned for something more, couldn't resist. Maybe we'd both be different people now, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. The line fell quiet, as if we both understood the weight of that maybe. As if even across the miles and the years, we could both feel the pull of something unfinished between us. A soft buzz from my phone startled me, and I realized with a pang that he'd sent a message. As I read it, a strange feeling pooled in my chest. Would you talk to me again sometime? My thumb hovered over the screen. I knew that this was dangerous, that nothing good could come from stirring up feelings that should stay buried. But I told myself it was just a conversation. Just one more. Yes, I typed back, letting the message send before I could rethink it. In the days that followed, our messages became a secret part of my life. Each text carried a thrill that I hadn't felt in years, a quiet rebellion against the dullness that had settled in my marriage. Dimitri knew how to make me laugh, how to remind me of the woman I once was, the woman who wasn't just Eric's wife, but Olga, passionate, curious, alive. Every message was a thrill, a quiet betrayal wrapped in words and ellipses, in emojis and haha replies. I felt myself being pulled into a space I couldn't control, but didn't want to leave. Then came the calls. It started innocently enough. A call to check in on a project he was working on, then a longer conversation about a book he'd read. Soon he was calling every few nights. The hours slipped by as we talked. We shared stories, opened up about parts of ourselves we kept hidden from everyone else. There was a trust between us, a sense of understanding that felt too precious to let go. Then one night he said something that shifted the ground beneath me. You know, sometimes when I'm lying awake, I imagine you're here with me. My heart pounded, a guilty thrill sparking in my chest. I knew it was wrong, that I was treading dangerously close to a line I couldn't cross. But I didn't stop him. In fact, I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me, imagining his hand reaching out across the distance, his presence filling the empty spaces in my life. Each call, each whispered confession, each late-night laugh brought us closer to an intimacy that was quickly becoming hard to ignore. I could feel myself slipping, my heart craving the closeness, the thrill that I'd lost in the routines of marriage. I told myself it was harmless, that as long as nothing physical happened, I wasn't truly betraying my husband. But with every word I knew I was lying to myself. Then one evening he asked, "When will I see you?" The question hung in the air like a forbidden fruit, tempting and dangerous. I should have said no. I should have deleted his number and focused on the life I'd chosen. But there was a part of me that was hungry, starving for the connection he offered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe sometime. Soon." He didn't push further. But I could hear the smile in his voice, feel the unspoken promise that lingered between us, binding us to a future we both pretended wasn't inevitable. The calls continued, and soon, even the act of putting my phone away felt like a betrayal. I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying his voice in my mind, feeling his words like a balm against the aching emptiness that had settled in my heart. Each time Eric held me, each time he looked at me with love and trust, I felt the sting of guilt, but it was a distant sensation, something I could ignore, until the next time Dimitri's name flashed across my screen. I knew it couldn't last. Sooner or later I would have to choose, to decide whether to walk away from the fantasy or give in to it completely. But for now I clung to those moments, to the thrill of stolen glances through a screen, of shared secrets whispered in the dark. And as the nights wore on, as the boundaries between us blurred, I realized I was no longer in control. Dimitri had rekindled something within me, something fierce and consuming, something I couldn't ignore. The days melted into one another, blurring in a strange haze of excitement and guilt. Each message from Dimitri felt like a small jolt, like a reminder that somewhere out there, he was waiting for my reply, counting down the minutes until he could hear from me again. And in a way I felt like I was counting too. I became more careful at home. Eric had always trusted me, and we'd fallen into that easy rhythm of married life where questions don't need to be asked, where routines carry us through without much suspicion. But now the ringing of my phone sent a small thrill of panic through me. I started keeping my phone on silent, and I would step into the kitchen or the bathroom if a message came through. I hated lying to Eric, hated the fact that I was creating secrets, but I couldn't stop myself from texting Dimitri back. And oh, how our conversations had changed. The flirtation that had once been mild, almost innocent, was now pulsing with a heat that I couldn't ignore. Sometimes he would call me late at night after Eric was asleep. I'd slip out of bed as quietly as I could and sneak into the living room, pressing the phone to my ear as if it were a lifeline. His voice, warm and low, would fill the silence of the dark room, and it was like he was right there with me, his presence wrapping around me in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. I felt like a teenager again, hiding my phone calls, whispering so no one would hear. One night, after weeks of dancing around it, he said, "Olga, you know, I can't stop thinking about you. I feel like we're unfinished business, you and I." I closed my eyes, feeling a flush creep up my cheeks even in the darkness. It was wrong, and I knew it, but there was something intoxicating about hearing him say it. He wasn't a memory anymore, a piece of my past. He was real, and he was right there, waiting on the other end of the line, wanting me. "But we can't, Dimitri," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm married. I made promises." He was silent for a moment, and I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd pushed him away. But then he sighed, and his voice softened. "I know, and I don't want to make things harder for you, but can you honestly tell me you don't feel anything? That all of this, everything we're sharing, is just nothing to you?" His words cut through me like a blade. How could I deny it? How could I lie to him, and to myself, when everything inside me was screaming that this was real, that what I felt for him was something I hadn't felt in years? I can't say that," I finally admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do with this, Dimitri. I don't know how to handle it." "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "Just be here with me. For now. Let's not think about tomorrow. Let's just have this. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that there were consequences to this. But as he spoke, a strange peace washed over me. For once, I didn't have to think about the future. I didn't have to make promises or decisions. All I had to do was be present, to let myself feel. And so, night after night, I slipped out of bed to talk to him, letting his words fill the empty spaces of my heart. We would talk for hours, sharing stories, reminiscing about the past, dreaming up fantasies that we both knew would never come true. Each call was a little rebellion, a quiet refusal to let go of the part of myself that still longed for something more. One night, the conversation took a turn that neither of us could ignore. "Do you ever wish things were different?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. My throat tightened and I struggled to find the words. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't drifted apart. If we'd tried harder." His silence spoke volumes. I could feel the weight of his own regrets, the things left unsaid between us, filling the space. And then with a quiet urgency he asked, "Olga, what would you say if I asked you to meet me?" I froze, the question hanging between us like a challenge. Meeting him would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross, a step into a territory I wasn't sure I could come back from. But even as I thought about it, a thrill coursed through me, a dangerous excitement that left me breathless. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know if I could." He didn't push me, didn't try to convince me. Instead he simply said, "Think about it. I'll be here if you decide to say yes." After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of seeing him, of stepping out of my carefully crafted life and into his arms, was like a forbidden fruit that I couldn't resist. Every time I looked at Eric, guilt clawed at me, reminding me of the life we'd built together, of the trust one was betraying. But there was another part of me, a darker, quieter part, that craved the excitement, the passion that Dmitri had rekindled within me. I started planning excuses, little lies I could tell to justify an absence. I hated myself for it, but each time I thought about meeting Dmitri, the guilt faded, replaced by a thrill that I hadn't felt in years. It was like a drug, intoxicating and dangerous, pulling me in deeper with each passing day. Finally, one evening, after a particularly heated conversation, I made my decision. "Dmitri," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I want to see you." There was a pause and I could almost feel his smile on the other end of the line. "I'll make it happen," he promised, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Just tell me when and where." We made plans, carefully choosing a day when Eric would be out of town for work. The days leading up to our meeting were a blur of nerves and excitement, each moment filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, that I was risking everything I'd built, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I wanted was to see him, to feel his presence, to lose myself in the memories we'd shared. The day finally arrived, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I felt alive, vibrant, like a version of myself I'd thought was long gone. My heart was pounding as I slipped out of the house, each step bringing me closer to a moment that would change everything. When I finally saw him, standing there with that familiar smile, I felt a surge of emotions that left me breathless. He looked older, a bit more weathered, but there was something in his eyes, a spark that reminded me of the man I'd once loved. We stood there in silence for a moment, just looking at each other, letting the weight of our past and the promise of our present settle between us. And then, without a word, he reached for me, pulling me into his arms. The world faded away as I felt his touch, his warmth, the undeniable connection that still existed between us. I knew in that moment that there was no going back. As we held each other, I realized that I was no longer the woman I'd been when we'd first met. I was older, wiser, and yet still just as vulnerable to the pull of my own heart. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if this would be a one-time moment or the beginning of something new. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew that, no matter what happened next, this was a chapter of my life I could never forget. After that first meeting, a veil had lifted and nothing felt the same. I returned home, slipped back into my life, into the role of wife, the quiet stability of it like a familiar blanket. But there was something irreparably different. Dmitri had unlocked a door inside of me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't close it again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at me whenever Eric would kiss me, his familiar affection now feeling heavy, undeserved. I'd find myself pulling away, making excuses for my own distance, a quiet desperation settling over me. Yet there was something else too. A lingering excitement, a hum of energy that hadn't been there in years. Each time my phone vibrated, each time I saw Dimitri's name light up on the screen, my heart would race and suddenly everything else would fade away. Our messages became a steady undercurrent in my life, something I found myself reaching for whenever I felt too confined by the reality I'd built. And it was no longer just stolen glances at my phone or hurried texts while Eric was in the shower. Dimitri and I were building a secret world all our own, one where we could be raw, unfiltered, and free. Every night after Eric had fallen asleep, I would tiptoe out of our bedroom, phone in hand, anticipation and nerves coursing through me. I'd sit on the living room couch, cocooned in darkness, and call him. His voice, always warm, always a bit rough around the edges, would wash over me, and suddenly I was someone else. Someone bold, someone unrestrained. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one night, his voice low like he was sharing a secret. "Regret what?" I whispered back, though I knew exactly what he meant. Leaving everything behind. Starting this life without me. It was a loaded question and he knew it. My life with Eric was good. It was stable, safe, everything I thought I wanted. But as Dimitri's words lingered in the air, I felt an ache I couldn't quite ignore. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely audible. Sometimes I wonder what might have been. If we had tried harder, if we'd been braver." He was silent for a long moment, and I could hear his breathing, steady and soft on the other end of the line. I knew he was letting my words sink in, considering their weight just as much as I was. "I think about it too, Olga," he said, his tone laced with a sadness that sent a shiver through me. "But what about now? What if now is our chance?" The suggestion hung in the air between us, both tempting and terrifying. I wanted to say yes, to surrender fully to whatever this was, but there was a part of me that couldn't let go of the life I'd built. And yet, with each passing day, the pull between us grew stronger, and it became harder to keep my feet planted firmly in the life I knew. The months slipped by and our connection deepened. Every stolen moment, every whispered confession over the phone, every shared memory had become something I craved, something I couldn't imagine letting go of. Dimitri knew me in a way no one else did. With him there was no need to hide, no need to pretend. He saw me, the real me, the version of myself I'd kept buried for years. Our meetings became more frequent, each one feeling like stepping into a parallel universe where nothing else mattered. We'd spend hours talking, lost in each other's company, the world outside fading into insignificance. There was a tenderness between us, a quiet understanding that filled the spaces words couldn't reach. With Dimitri, I didn't have to be anyone but myself, and for the first time in years I felt free. One night, after a particularly long and intense conversation, he asked me something that caught me off guard. "Olga, do you think we're falling in love all over again?" The question was simple, almost casual, but it struck a chord deep within me. Love. It was a word I'd been avoiding, a concept I tried to keep at a distance, afraid of what it might mean for everything else in my life. But as I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, the weight of his question settled over me, heavy and undeniable. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe we never stopped." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a silence filled with everything we couldn't say, everything we were afraid to admit. And in that moment I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't just a fling, a passing infatuation. It was something real, something powerful, something that could change everything. Dimitri's voice was soft when he finally spoke, his words careful, as if he was afraid of breaking the fragile understanding between us. "If that's true, then what do we do, Olga? Where do we go from here?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let go of him, couldn't imagine my life without the warmth of his presence, the comfort of his voice. He had become a part of me, a piece of my soul that I couldn't ignore. We take it one day at a time," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what the future holds, Dimitri. I just know that I need you." As the weeks went on, our secret life became more real to me than the life I shared with Eric. I was living two separate lives, each one pulling me in different directions, each one demanding a piece of me. And yet I couldn't choose. With Dmitry, I felt alive, like I was finally stepping into a version of myself that I'd forgotten. But with Eric, there was stability, a comfort in the familiar, a history that we'd built together. One evening, as I lay in bed next to Eric, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, I realized that I was nearing a breaking point. I couldn't keep lying, couldn't keep hiding this part of myself. Something had to give. The next morning, I decided to meet Dmitry in person, hoping that seeing him face to face would bring me some clarity. We met at a small cafe, a quiet place where we wouldn't be recognized. As soon as I saw him, my heart ached with a strange mixture of joy and sorrow. He looked at me with an intensity that took my breath away. His eyes filled with a longing that mirrored my own. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't keep living two lives. It's tearing me apart." He reached across the table, his hand warm against mine. "Then come with me, Olga. Leave all of this behind. We could start fresh, you and I." The offer was tempting, almost too tempting. But as I looked at him, I felt a wave of doubt, a fear of the unknown that I couldn't shake. Leaving Eric would mean letting go of everything I'd built, everything I'd known. It would mean stepping into a world of uncertainty, a world where Dmitry and I would have to start from scratch, build a new life together. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to let go." He nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "I won't push you, Olga. But know that I'm here waiting. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." As we parted ways, I felt a heaviness settle over me. A feeling of being caught between two worlds, two loves, two versions of myself. I didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if I would ever be able to make a choice. But for now, I held on to the moments we shared. The stolen glances, the whispered confessions, the quiet, forbidden love that had become a part of my life. And as I walked away, I knew that no matter what happened, Dmitry would always hold a piece of my heart. A piece I would never get back. After that meeting, a kind of melancholy settled over me. An awareness that I was teetering on the edge of two lives, unable to fully commit to either. I felt like a ghost, moving through the motions of my everyday life with Eric, but constantly haunted by the memory of Dmitry's gaze, his words, his offer. The routine of our marriage, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Every smile Eric gave me tinged with guilt I could barely hide. But I couldn't let go of Dmitry. It was as if I was bound to him by invisible strings, ones that stretched across cities and lifetimes, linking us in a way that defied logic and reason. Our conversations grew even more intense, our calls longer and our messages more frequent. It wasn't just a desire to be with him. It was the feeling that without him I was somehow incomplete. One evening, as Eric sat beside me watching TV, I found myself pulling away. He reached for my hand and I forced myself to smile, to let him feel that connection, but my mind was elsewhere. That night I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to the moments I'd shared with Dmitry, the way he made me feel seen, alive. It was as if I'd tasted something forbidden, something sweeter than I'd ever known, and now nothing else could satisfy me. The next day, Dmitry texted me something that set my heart racing. "Olga, I need to see you again. Just for a little while. Just us." I stared at the message, feeling a thrill and a pang of guilt all at once. I should have said no, should have ignored it and focused on my life, my marriage. But instead, my fingers moved of their own accord, typing back a simple yes. I knew I was making a choice, knew that meeting him again would only pull me further into the tangled web we'd woven. And yet I couldn't stop myself. We arranged to meet at a small hotel just outside the city, a place where we wouldn't be recognized, where we could be alone without the prying eyes of anyone who knew us. I drove there in a haze, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. When I arrived, I saw him waiting outside, his gaze searching the parking lot until he spotted me. As I got out of the car, I felt a rush of emotions. He looked at me with such intensity, such longing, that I felt myself melt under his gaze. Without a word, he took my hand, leading me inside. We found our room, and as soon as the door closed behind us, it was as if the world outside ceased to exist. We talked, first cautiously, then more openly, our words filling the quiet space around us. We shared secrets, dreams, confessions. He told me about the moments he'd missed me, about the nights he'd spent lying awake, wondering if he'd ever have the chance to hold me again. His words were a balm to my soul, easing a loneliness I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. But it was more than words that brought us together that day. The electricity between us was palpable, the tension hanging in the air like a live wire. And slowly, inevitably, we found ourselves inching closer, our hands reaching out, our breaths mingling. When he finally pulled me into his arms, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years, a feeling that seemed to light up every part of me. The hours we spent together felt timeless, as if we'd been transported to a world all our own, one where our responsibilities, our commitments, our pasts didn't matter. All that existed was the present, the two of us, and the love that had been waiting dormant for so long. But as the afternoon light began to fade, reality crept back in. I felt a wave of guilt settle over me, a reminder of the life I would be returning to, the promises I'd made. Dmitri seemed to sense it too, his expression softening as he pulled me close. "Olga," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "I know this isn't easy for you. I know what's at stake. But no matter what happens, know that I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." His words were a comfort, but they didn't ease the ache inside me. I knew that eventually I would have to make a choice, to either step fully into this life with him or let him go. But for now, all I could do was hold on to the moment, onto the feeling of his arms around me, his heartbeat steady against mine. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car, his hand lingering on mine as he whispered a soft goodbye. I felt a pang as I drove away, as if I were leaving a part of myself behind. The drive home felt endless, and by the time I walked through the door, the guilt had settled heavily on my shoulders. Eric greeted me with his usual warmth, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. I forced myself to smile, to act as if everything were normal, but inside I was unraveling. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, that eventually something would have to give. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, each one more intense than the last. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between the life I knew and the life I longed for. Every message from Dmitri was a reminder of the passion, the joy, the sense of freedom he brought into my world. And every time Eric looked at me with trust and love, I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me, crushing me under its weight. One evening, as Eric and I sat down for dinner, he looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Olga," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I feel like something's been different lately. Like you're distant. Is everything okay?" The question hit me like a blow. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the truth and let the chips fall where they may. But as I looked into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of hurting him, of shattering the life we'd built together, was too much to bear. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a little stressed, I guess. Work has been a lot lately." He nodded, his gaze softening, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "If there's anything you need, anything I can do, just tell me. Okay? I'm here for you." His kindness only deepened my guilt, and that night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I couldn't go on like this, couldn't keep living two lives torn between two loves. But the thought of letting go of Dmitri, of losing the connection we shared, was just as painful. In the days that followed, I tried to pull away from Dmitri to create distance between us. I stopped responding to his messages as quickly, made excuses to avoid our late-night calls. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed to focus on my marriage, to repair the damage I'd caused. But every time I ignored his call, every time I left his message unread, a part of me felt like it was dying. Finally, one evening after a week of silence, he called me, and this time I couldn't resist. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Olga," he said, his tone filled with quiet desperation. "I can't do this without you. I thought we had something real." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. "We do, Dmitri," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to make this work. I'm tearing myself apart trying to be two people, trying to live two lives. I can't keep doing this." There was a long silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet resignation. "Then maybe it's time to choose. I don't want to force you, Olga, But I can't keep waiting forever. If we're going to have a future, it has to be real. It has to be just us. His words lingered in the air. A choice laid out before me. One that would shape the rest of my life. I knew I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the decision I'd been avoiding. It was time to choose, to either step fully into this love with Dmitry, or let it go and commit to the life I'd built with Eric. As I lay there, the weight of the decision pressing down on me, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I didn't know what I would choose, didn't know what the future held. But for the first time I felt ready to face it, to confront the reality of my choices, and to finally step into the life I was meant to live. The next morning as the sun rose, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the decision that would change everything. The next morning dawned hazy and quiet, the kind of morning that made the world feel suspended in time. I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choices like a stone in my chest. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of memories with Eric, of laughter and warmth and comfort. But threaded through those memories were flashes of Dmitry, of his gaze that seemed to see right into my soul, of the fire in his eyes that reminded me of a version of myself I'd lost long ago. I knew that whatever choice I made would come with a cost, that there was no way to untangle this without hurting someone. But after last night's call, I also knew that I couldn't keep living like this. As I rose to get dressed, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a clarity that had been missing for so long. I told myself I needed to talk to Dmitry one last time, to see him, to confront this intensity between us face to face. Perhaps then I'd find the strength to decide, to either step into a life with him or to finally let go. I messaged him with a simple, "Can we meet today?" My hands trembled as I hit send, but almost immediately, his reply came, "Name the place and I'll be there." We agreed to meet in a quiet park outside the city, far from where anyone might recognize us. The drive there felt surreal, as if I were watching myself from afar. Each mile brought a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. It felt like I was on the edge of something monumental, something that would define who I was going forward. When I arrived, Dmitry was already waiting, standing under a tree with his hands in his pockets, watching the entrance. The moment he saw me, his face softened, and he broke into that familiar, heart-stopping smile. I felt my breath catch, the familiar rush of emotions crashing over me as I walked toward him. "Olga," he murmured as I reached him, his voice filled with warmth and relief. He stepped forward, his hands gently taking mine, his touch grounding me in a way that was both comforting and electrifying. For a long moment we just stood there, staring at each other, letting the silence speak for us. Finally I broke the stillness, my voice a whisper. "Dmitry, I don't know what to do. I feel so lost." He squeezed my hands, his gaze intense and unwavering. "You don't have to know everything right now. But I know what I feel for you and I think you feel it too. All I'm asking is that you trust it. Trust it." The words echoed in my mind, stirring something deep within me. But trust felt like such a fragile thing in this moment, as if it could shatter with one wrong move. Still looking into his eyes, I felt a pull that was undeniable, a connection that felt so real it terrified me. We found a quiet bench in a secluded part of the park, and we sat down, the sounds of the world fading into the background as we began to talk. I told him about the conflict tearing me apart, about the guilt that seemed to shadow every moment with Eric, the longing that seemed to color every conversation with him. He listened, his expression soft and understanding, and I could see the pain in his eyes as I confessed just how divided my heart had become. "Olga," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable sadness, "I don't want to be the reason you hurt yourself like this. But I also don't want to let you go. You mean too much to me. We've lost so many years already. If we have a chance to be happy, to be truly happy, isn't that worth fighting for?" His words lingered in the air, a question that struck at the very heart of my dilemma. Was it selfish to want that happiness, to reach for it despite the life I'd already built with Eric? Or was it a betrayal to even consider leaving everything behind for something that might not last? "I'm scared, Dmitry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm scared of hurting him. I'm scared of ruining everything." He reached for my hand again, his touch gentle, grounding. "Maybe it's okay to be scared. Maybe it just means that whatever we feel here between us, it's real. And real things are worth the risk, even if it's terrifying." We sat there in silence, letting the weight of his words settle between us. I felt my heart aching, torn between the safety of the life I knew and the unknown promise of a life with him. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it might mean to walk away from the life I'd built, to leave behind everything familiar for something that felt so uncertain yet so right. He didn't push me. He simply sat there holding my hand, his presence a quiet reassurance that whatever choice I made, he would understand. After a long quiet moment, I looked at him, my mind finally beginning to settle. Dimitri, I think I need time to figure this out, to really know what I want. He nodded, his expression filled with both pain and understanding. I'll give you all the time you need, Olga. Just promise me you won't shut me out completely. I swallowed, feeling the weight of his request, the silent promise that I would be giving if I agreed. I promise, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We parted with a quiet, lingering embrace, and as I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of peace and sadness. I knew I had to go home to face Eric, to really confront the reality of the life I'd been leading. And I knew that it wouldn't be easy, that every step would feel like I was tearing myself apart. But for the first time I felt ready to face it, to finally be honest with myself and perhaps with him. That evening, as I sat across from Eric at the dinner table, I could feel the tension building within me. Every word felt heavy, every smile forced. Finally, as we finished eating, he looked at me, his gaze searching. Olga, he said softly, his voice filled with concern. Are you okay? You've been so distant lately. I feel like you're somewhere else. His words cut through me, and I felt a wave of guilt and sorrow so deep that it nearly took my breath away. I knew that I couldn't keep lying to him, couldn't keep hiding the truth. He deserved better than that. Taking a deep breath, I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine, feeling the familiar warmth of his touch, the steady presence he'd been in my life for so many years. Eric, I need to tell you something. I began, my voice trembling. I don't know how to say this, and I don't know where it will lead us, but I haven't been honest with you. He looked at me, his expression shifting from confusion to worry, and I felt my heart clench. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change, where the life we'd built would be laid bare. Its flaws exposed, its secrets revealed. I've been talking to someone, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone from my past. And it's brought up feelings that I didn't know were still there. Feelings that I've tried to ignore, but I can't anymore. The words hung in the air, each one a confession, a betrayal, a plea for understanding. Eric's expression shifted, pain flashing in his eyes, and I felt my heart break all over again. Olga, he whispered, his voice filled with hurt. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know how, I replied, my own voice breaking. I was scared of hurting you, scared of losing everything we've built. But I realize now that hiding it, pretending it doesn't exist, it's only making things worse. He looked away, his face drawn and filled with a pain that cut me to the core. And in that moment I knew that I couldn't go back, that whatever happened next, I had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. We spent the next few hours talking, sharing the truths we'd both kept hidden, the wounds we'd ignored for so long. And as dawn began to break, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a sense that no matter where this path led, I was finally being honest, finally facing the reality of who I was and what I wanted. In the days that followed, I took the time to be alone, to truly consider my feelings, to sort through the tangled mess of emotions that had taken over my life. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to find the courage to make a choice, to step into a future that was uncertain, but that felt for the first time like it was truly my own. And as I stood on the threshold of that future, I knew that whatever happened, I would face it with an open heart, ready to embrace the life I had been too afraid to live. The days stretched on like a slow, painful unwinding. After my confession, a raw silence settled between Eric and me. I could tell he was hurt, but he didn't lash out, didn't give me the angry outburst I half expected. Instead, he withdrew, his gaze distant, his touches tentative, as if he were afraid I might break. It made the house feel hollow, each room carrying the weight of our unspoken words, our fractured trust. I spent those days in a haze, searching myself, trying to understand how I had gotten here, and what I truly wanted. Part of me longed for the safety and comfort of my life with Eric. Despite everything, he was my home, my rock, the one person who had been there through all of life's highs and lows. But then there was the undeniable pull of Dmitry, the fire he'd reignited in me, the sense of freedom and excitement I hadn't felt in years. With him, I felt like I was shedding the layers of caution and restraint that had come to define my life. But it wasn't just about choosing between two men. I was choosing between two versions of myself, the woman I was with Eric, solid and dependable, and the woman I became with Dmitry, vibrant and unapologetically alive. Days passed, and I found myself thinking about that woman I used to be, the version of me I'd buried when I settled into the rhythm of married life. I remembered dreams I'd once had, places I'd wanted to see, passions I'd let go of. I realized how easily I'd given up those parts of myself, telling myself it was simply part of growing up, of making a life with someone else. But now, standing at this crossroads, I couldn't ignore those pieces any longer. Then one night, after another long and silent dinner with Eric, I found myself stepping out of the house and into the cool night air. I walked, letting the quiet of the neighborhood calm my racing thoughts, until I found myself standing by the water at the edge of a small park. I breathed in deeply, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, and felt a sense of clarity wash over me. In that stillness, I made a decision. I couldn't keep tearing myself in two, living with one foot in each world. I owed it to both Eric and myself to be honest, to make a choice even if it was painful. And I knew that in order to move forward, I needed to confront my feelings for Dmitry face to face one last time, to understand if what we had was real or simply the pull of nostalgia and the fantasy of what might have been. The next morning I texted Dmitry, asking him to meet me. This time I suggested a quiet coffee shop downtown, a place where I knew we could talk openly without fear of running into anyone who knew us. My hands shook as I hit send, my heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. I wasn't sure what I would say, or even if I'd be strong enough to let go, but I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo. When I arrived at the cafe, Dmitry was already there, waiting by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with a familiar warmth that both comforted and unsettled me. I felt a pang of longing, but also a sense of sadness, knowing that whatever happened today, we were standing on the edge of something that could never be undone. "Olga," he greeted me, his voice soft as he stood to pull out a chair for me. "Thank you for meeting me." I gave him a small smile, sitting down across from him, feeling the weight of the moment settle over us. For a few minutes we sat in silence, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Finally, I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. "Dmitry, I don't know how to say this, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep hurting everyone around me, including myself." My voice was quiet but steady, carrying the resolve I'd spent so many sleepless nights finding. He nodded, his eyes searching mine, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "I know, Olga. I don't want to make this harder for you, but I need to know, what do you feel for me? Is there a future for us? Or is this just a beautiful memory we keep reliving?" His question struck at the heart of my dilemma. I felt a pang of longing, of loss, as I looked into his eyes, the depth of his feelings laid bare before me. But in that moment I also felt something else. A sense of clarity, a realization that I'd been avoiding for so long. "I don't know if I'm in love with you, Dmitry," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I know I care about you, that what we have is real. But I also know that part of what I feel is tied to a version of myself I haven't let go of, to a part of me that's afraid of missing out, of losing the chance to be more than just a wife, a role, a responsibility." He nodded slowly, his gaze filled with understanding and acceptance, though I could see the hurt in his eyes. "Olga, I don't want to be the reason you feel trapped, or the reason you feel like you're less than who you are. I only wanted to remind you of what it feels like to be free, to be alive." His words resonated within me, a reminder that what I had felt for him was a longing not just for love, but for a part of myself I'd forgotten. I realized then that perhaps Dmitry had been a mirror, reflecting back the dreams, the passions, the hidden parts of me that I'd buried under layers of compromise and routine. "But I also know that I can't ask you to wait for me, to hold on to something that may never come to pass," I continued, my voice thick with emotion. "I love the life I've built with Eric, even if it's flawed, even if it feels incomplete sometimes. I can't abandon it for a life I'm not sure about. A love that may be more of a longing for what I lost than for what I truly need. Dmitry looked down, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw clenched. I could see the struggle within him, the part of him that wanted to fight, to ask me to take the leap with him. But when he finally looked up, there was a calm acceptance in his gaze, a quiet strength that touched me deeply. "I understand, Olga," he said, his voice gentle, though I could hear the strain. "I won't ask you for anything more than you can give. But know that I'll always care for you. That I'll always remember what we had. And I hope you find that part of yourself, whether it's with me or with someone else." A tear slipped down my cheek, and he reached across the table, brushing it away with a tenderness that made my heart ache. In that touch I felt a goodbye, a quiet surrender to the reality of our situation. We sat there for a while, holding hands, letting the silence fill the space between us, saying everything we couldn't put into words. When I finally left the cafe, I felt both a sense of loss and a quiet peace, a release from the tension that had gripped me for so long. I knew that I would carry Dmitry with me, that he had become a part of my story, a chapter that would remain forever etched in my memory. But I also knew that I had made the right choice, that by letting him go, I was making space to heal, to rebuild the life I had with Eric. That evening as I returned home, I felt a strange sense of calm. Eric greeted me with a cautious smile, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, silently promising him that I was ready to commit fully, to face whatever came next with honesty and love. We talked late into the night, sharing fears, regrets, and dreams we'd long hidden from each other. For the first time, I felt a sense of connection that went beyond the surface, a quiet strength that came from facing the truth and choosing each other despite the flaws, despite the challenges. We knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be days when the past would cast shadows over us, but we were ready to confront them together. Months passed and life slowly settled back into a rhythm, though one that felt different, more real. Eric and I grew closer, rediscovering parts of each other that we'd let slip away in the busyness of daily life. I found myself reconnecting with old hobbies, exploring parts of myself that had nothing to do with marriage or roles or responsibilities. And in that journey I found a piece of freedom, a sense of self that I hadn't known I could have within my marriage. Dmitry and I spoke once more, a brief conversation filled with kindness and understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the impact we'd had on each other's lives. And though we knew that our paths had diverged, there was no bitterness, no regret, only gratitude for the lessons, the growth, and the love we'd shared. Looking back, I realized that Dmitry had given me a gift, a reminder to never lose sight of who I was, of the dreams and desires that made me feel alive. And as I walked forward into my life with Eric, I carried that lesson with me, a reminder that love, real love, is not about losing yourself, but about finding someone who helps you grow into the fullest version of who you're meant to be.